Welcome to the Art of Action Figures. On this episode, we'll be taking a look at Bandai Tamashii Nation's SH Figuarts Guts Berserker Armor version from Berserk. What's left to say about this figure? He has some very well-documented issues. I want to dig a little bit deeper into how those issues might have come about. Offer some ideas, for example, why the wrists are designed the way they are. I've watched several reviews of this figure, and not a single one has properly demonstrated how these shoulder joints work. And I think part of the reason is my left shoulder in particular was too tight out of the box in multiple places, because it's a very complex joint in that shoulder. If you're trying to move it around and it's not moving, you might think there's not even a joint there. I want to take the time to demonstrate how I think the shoulders are supposed to work now that I've gotten mine to work, and hopefully that helps people to enjoy this figure a little bit more. Things like that I'm very interested in digging into, so that's what we're going to do here today. I have never read Berserk, and I'm not sure that I would like it if I did. I love this design. I'm a big fan of the gothic horror fantasy warrior vibe that he's got going on. I was kind of content to eye this figure from afar, but when I saw just how negatively collectors were reacting to it, it almost piqued my interest even more. Usually on this channel, I'm not going to be showcasing figures that I don't find something to enjoy. Because I just won't buy them. So, what intrigued me the most here is, depending on who you ask, this Guts figure could either be the best or worst figure of the year, and possibly of the entire SH Figuarts line. And it's hyperbolic statements like that kind of attract me like a magnet to try to dig in a little bit and maybe temper the response. What draws me to this figure is more its construction as an action figure and the character design. Now, from the start, this figure has a lot of good things working in its favor. Number one, it's a very popular IP, especially among adult collectors. In promotional images and displays, the figures have looked very, very good. Guts here also has a couple of things working against him. Number one, he's expensive, and that creates certain expectations, and I'll talk about whether or not those are warranted in a minute. Number two, his design is very complex. The plate armor, the straps, the pouches, the weapons, makes for a lot of separate parts that need to be designed, possibly using different materials, and assembled. And it also means that there are a lot of very small parts, which can be quite fragile when made of plastic. And finally, we have here the original BFS, which of course stands for Big Fantasy Sword. There have been, like I said, a couple of very well-documented concerns about this figure, and I think to summarize it, it mostly comes down to what I was talking about with complexity and some fragile parts, some problems with joint tolerances. And I've run into a couple. I'll talk through how I've worked around them, but at this point, I'm pretty satisfied with what I've got here. Finally, the wrist swaps. They're unlike any other Figuarts figure that I've owned. They're more like a Mafex style wrist straight peg instead of a ball peg. And the sockets on the alternate hand pieces are out of the box, for me, not wide enough to put onto the wrist peg. So I had to use a little bit of heat to soften the hands, and I was able to attach them no problem. Even once you do get that alternate like sword holding hand attached, The sword is still very heavy. And as a result, it can actually pull the hand off of the wrist peg. I think there's a very good reason for that, and I'll talk about it later in the video when we start equipping the accessories. This is a very expensive figure, coming in around $100 US. I think that plays a pretty important role in the intensity of the negative reactions that this figure has gotten. Some people have the expectation that expensive equals perfect. I don't think that's really a reliable rule. Really, the thing that correlates most with price is how expensive was this to produce. And that can be for a lot of different reasons, but usually it's complexity at various stages. So complexity in design, complexity in manufacturing, complexity in assembly or distribution. All of those things are ultimately kind of what go into the price. And so because complexity makes a figure more expensive, and complexity also makes a figure more unstable, let's say, I often find there's a negative correlation between price and quality or stability. Taking a look at the front of the box, you have your pretty typical layout for a Figuarts, for a modern Figuarts box. Bandai Tamashii Nations holographic quality sticker. Also is your sort of authenticity sticker, which is why it's important to save your import figure boxes. Name of the manga, Berserk, obviously. #1 fantasy comic presented by Miura Kentaro with Studio Gaga. Designed by Tamashii Nations in Japan, Bandai Spirits made in China. We've got the name of the character, Guts, Berserker Armor variant. I understand this is sort of like wearing the armor, but it's in a deactivated state. And the Berserker armor is like Kaioken. That's the way I've heard it described. And my understanding from that is it makes him more powerful, but like destroys his body. So, makes sense looking at him. And let's see. We also have some character art instead of a figure photo, which is very interesting. That's pretty unique, actually. And there is a sort of like watermark brand of sacrifice. Pretty cool. The way that that's been carved out there with the glossy finish. Bandai Namco, SH Figuarts. Some blurb about SH Figuarts. Humanoid action. Spinning around to the right-hand side, we have a very, very, very long-looking sword. We have a photo of the figure now in a sort of horizontal sword swing. Name of the character again. Another glossy brand of sacrifice. And then one thing I wanted to highlight while I've got it in this orientation is it still doesn't even completely fit in frame, but here is a standard Figuarts box from Boy from the Future Trunks, and you can see this box is extremely tall. Did it need to be this tall? Maybe. We'll see. I think they maybe could have done something with the tray to make it a little bit deeper, perhaps. Not quite so tall. Just makes it a little bit hard to store the box. On the opposite side, it looks like another more kind of dramatic portrait style photo of the figure. He's kind of got like this smoky castle looking background behind him. Great detail captured on this sword. And name of the figure again. This is the side of the box I like to display. On the top, same idea. Another action photo this time. Name of the character. On the bottom, here's your distribution information. I got this in the US from Big Bad Toy Store. In my experience, they've been really good about customer support if I do have issues with figures. But if that fails, you can always go directly to the distributor using the information down here. Okay, and finally, around the back, the all-important warning, ages 15 and up, choking, hazard, small parts, not for children under 3 years. Series of promotional photos here showing off the different face portraits, the detailed printing of the brand on his neck, and the words that they've chosen to highlight in English are face, sculpture, action, and option. So I think that speaks really well to the things that I love about Figuarts. Great sculpting, statuesque, really expressive faces and like character details, action, great articulation, and posability, and options, meaning great accessories. So yeah, that is the Figuarts brand in a nutshell. Overall, really nice box. Just wish it was a little bit shorter so that it fit better on my shelf. Now it's time for the unboxing. I've got a trusty hobby knife, which I have used to slice the tape on the right-hand side. And then I'm just going to take the blade and gently slide it under the flap, push towards the back of the box, and pop past the inner flap. Do the same on the opposite side, gently under the flap, push towards the back, and pop, and a nice cleanly open flap. We have some instructions printed on the inside of the flap. They suggest you remove the collar before replacing the face. It shows you how to attach his cloak, how to store his bow gun, and how to swap out the alternate left arms. Okay. And then inside the box, behind the figure tray, is this very creepy, glossy red print of the bayonet. Looking at our extremely tall tray, we can see all of the accessories that are included with Guts, the figure himself, and then he has a green bayonet, a dagger in a sheathed dagger for his belt, his BFS, I believe it's called the Dragon Slayer, his arm cannon, alternate hands including sword holding left and right hand, fist right hand, bow gun grip left hand, shouting face, and a gritting teeth angry face. Okay. And then finally, one more accessory on the back, and that is his cloak, which is just taped to the back of the tray in a plastic bag. Okay. Now, lifting the lid off of the tray, we'll get this figure out, and I'll talk you through my kind of first impressions of the sculpt and build. If you saw my review for Legendary Super Saiyan Goku, I talked about he has this intangible quality where almost anything you do with the figure looks good. Guts here has almost the opposite. If you're not intentional with the way that you pose him, he can look a little bit awkward. And so right out of the box, if you don't do anything to position his shoulders or his arms or his legs or his hips, and you just kind of set him up in like a bland, neutral stance, and we'll get to the cape. Same applies to the cape. If you don't pose the fabric in any way, it's going to look awkward. And so it's easy to lob criticism on the basis of that. But I think what they're really saying is, I don't want to take the time to pose it in a way that doesn't look awkward. But for example, I've seen a lot of comments about his arms being kind of thin and long. Well, first of all, part of the design is to allow for this type of motion on that extended ball peg. And the reason for that is it gives you the ability to actually position the shoulders. It makes his arms look a little bit more appropriate length. And so all I'm doing there is taking that ball peg and positioning it toward the back, up and towards his back. And immediately, I think that looks a lot better. Okay, so I don't think it like totally dismisses the idea that his arms are too long, but again, the designers worked with the studio behind the manga to create action figure based on their designs and their feedback. Guts has pretty long arms if you look at the source material, and it might not be completely an aesthetic choice because a little bit of extension in the arms can be a trade-off for him to bring the hands together more easily for two-handed sword poses, which I would think are a priority for this character. Okay, we've talked about the length of the arms. Let's also talk about the thickness of the arms. Again, I think it's just a matter of priorities and trade-offs. If it's a deal breaker for you that he doesn't have a perfectly anatomical shoulder under layers of plate armor, then I guess this isn't the figure for you. Personally, I don't care at all. Oh, well, it looks really ugly when you raise the arm. All I did was articulate those armor pieces a little bit, and you can easily cover up whatever gap you don't like. While we're talking about sculpt proportions, I want to do something that I like to do from time to time when those topics come up, which is let's just look at the silhouette. And so the way I like to do this is we'll set the figure up in kind of a neutral stance here. And we'll go ahead and throw the light coming from behind, turn off the light coming from the front. There we go. We've got a very clean silhouette now. Again, it's sculpt, but it's also prioritizing dynamic, action-oriented design as well. That is the Figuarts trademark brand. That is what it says all over the box. So don't go to the banana store unless you want a banana. All right. Let's just take a few minutes to take this in, okay? Now, something I'll note while I'm spinning him around, you can see his belt is kind of an awkward disconnect there. That's why you have the sheathed dagger to complete that sculpt. So let's go ahead and attach that. Okay, and then the final accessory to attach to complete his silhouette is the cape. I'm going to go ahead and turn the lights back up just to show you how to attach it. Now the cape is very unique. I have never seen a cape like this canvas kind of material. You can hear that sound it makes, and I hope that helps you get an idea for the texture. Two-ply, and the wire is just embedded between them, and it runs through a couple of places. So it's kind of around the perimeter, all the way around, so that's great. It has like a bit of wiggle in it at the bottom, which I don't really know why. It runs around the top, but only around the back of the collar, and then it runs down in two places, right there and right there. And the material is very interesting. It's almost like denim or something. Like a very thin tote bag kind of material. And I don't really have a problem with it. I think the reason they've gone with it is it's a little bit stiffer. They have also included this like printing pattern, which is shaded lighter toward the top and then darker toward the bottom. To attach the cape, I'm going to remove the stored crossbow just for easy access to his back. I'm going to remove his collar piece, being very careful since this is one of those fragile bits we talked about. Removed the face, and then I'm going to position the head forward like this so that it's near the hook that the cape needs to go over. Actually, I'm going to pull the shoulders down so they're out of the way. And then I find it helps to use something a little bit precise, like a pointer or a pen with a soft tip, and just push it in. I'm going to attach the face part back on, put the collar piece back on, I'll reposition his shoulders, and again, here's what I'm talking about with if you put no effort into posing this guy and you just like either intentionally or unintentionally set him up, he can look really quite awkward. His shoulders are really low. Okay, well, let's push them back and up. And his cape isn't laying naturally. Okay, well, let's pull it down and back using the wires. Now, I've got one problem here with a wire protruding, but it's pretty easy enough to just tuck it under something. And with just a little bit of care and intention, the figure really starts to look a whole lot better. Alright, starting with the portraits, these are wonderful. The likeness is impeccable. And what a striking design for a face with that one eye shut, that pop of white hair, the details from the scarring, the closed eye, the wide, wild red eye, the furrowed brow. Even the skin tone has a very natural look to it, which can't be said of all Figuarts. I've seen quite a lot of their anime and manga figures, like in the Naruto and Jujutsu Kaisen lines, with like kind of weird milky skin tone. The armor is done wonderfully. Every little plane, every plate is exquisitely sculpted and textured. It really does look like an elaborate set of Gothic armor. And I think it is beautiful. To recreate this sort of like telescoping design, everything converges to this point on either side, and it just creates these really, really beautiful lines. The texture is this really nice brushed gunmetal look. Straps and pouches are all in this really richly colored brown, light brown leather, which sits very nicely in contrast with the dark gray armor. You can see the hilt on this dagger has silver metallic parts as well as white grip. Stitching, texture, detail on them. Silver buckle on this pouch. More silver daggers going down the thigh. Lifting up the cape. You see more details on the back. This pouch, it looks like they missed a silver buckle there. I'm guessing they cut that one because it's hidden by the cape. Little bit of a shame, but not the worst. They did, however, paint the bottom of this strap with the silver. The belts continued around these butt plates. Another pouch, another button. The stored crossbow matches this like really rough metallic texture from his arm. Inverted curve of the lower leg. And then even on the knees, there is this like winged detail repeated on both sides. More layers, more plates. And then finally, at the feet, even more detail down to the plates at the back of the ankle and down to the heel. This wrap around his wrist is painted very cleanly. Continues on to the hand, and each of the right hands has the same application. Done really, really well. And then on his left arm, the wrap motif is repeated, but instead it's on the elbow. There's this mechanical brace that articulates a little bit with the elbow. And then his Inspector Gadget arm with all of those fine details, even at the knuckles there. And at the back of the neck, not to be missed, is the brand of sacrifice. A very, very specific design detail. I mean, this is a highlight of this figure for sure, and reviews have done a great job capturing it in very high definition. But what I haven't seen is something to convey just how small this detail is. So here is the tip of my pen, and you can see it is smaller than the tip. All of that detail is squeezed into an area smaller than his hand, which is already fairly tiny. Really impressive work there. The instructions, like I said, do suggest you remove the collar before swapping the face, just to avoid breaking that since it is a rather small, delicate piece. Then to swap the face, you can just pull the neutral face off. I find it's easier to do it from under the chin. Let's go ahead and equip the shouting face. There we go. A little bit of a tight fit. Again, really incredible detail. Go ahead and reattach his collar. Let's try the cannon arm. To do that, just pull this mechanical arm off at the forearm and push the mechanical arm on. A little bit tight. Cannon arm comes with a hand already attached to the end that is not meant to be exchanged. Let's go ahead and just show off what he can do with this. And here's where you gotta be intentional with posing the cape to follow the action. So if he's running this way, we're gonna get that cape billowing behind him. And again, you just kind of gotta give it a scrunch in the direction that you want. The main thing you want with an arm cannon is to be able to put the opposite hand onto the firing arm, and he's doing that no problem whatsoever. And I'm going to try to get him to balance, but I mentioned the ankles are not the sturdiest. There we go. Alright, next let's try the crossbow arm. You can see there's brown paint on this mechanical air cannon sort of thing. String's a little bit thicker than I'd like, but I'm guessing that's just like as thin as they could possibly make this plastic. Okay, so that hand does separate at the thumb, and then you can just peg it on. The handle here, sort of like crank for his arm, is on just a straight peg. So you can pull it out and swivel it around to whatever position you want, but be very careful. It's a very, very thin, hard plastic, and there's a reason the instructions point out that it is very delicate. what we're really looking for here is the sword poses, so let's go ahead and equip the sword holding left hand. And let's throw the gritted teeth expression on instead of the shouting one. We'll go over how to equip the sword, and then later in the video I'll also explain how to pose him with the sword. Look at how exaggerated that scrunch is at the bridge of the nose. Pearly whites. Must have very good dental care. And again, you see this gap appearing here. If you don't like that, just turn the arm a little tiny amount. That's why there's a point of articulation there that is separate from the bicep. Before we get the sword out, there is one more accessory I don't want to miss, and that is his bayonet here. It's got this Picasso face, the mouth here, closed eyes, and a nose. It's green, which probably means something, but yeah, he can hold it in his relaxed hand, and it's a spooky little thing. Taking a look at this sword, you can see it is taller than the figure by quite a bit. And this presents some very interesting design challenges. It is balanced, let's see, around this point in the blade, and it's made of what feels like a very hard, light plastic. This is about as light as a 3D sculpt piece of plastic can get, but it is still very large. And just due to the size and the shape, which they wanted to create accurately here, it does have a tendency to drag itself down. Now, as far as its details, you can see it has this really, really cool like stone texture almost in the center of the blade. This metallic finish around the perimeter of the blade, a metal ring, which doesn't really serve any purpose as far as I can tell. Maybe it's used to hook it on his back, but he doesn't have anything with which to do that. And then this wrap around the handle, and a dark metallic pommel, which is removable along with this little end of the wrap. It can be inserted at any angle so that you can position the wrap according to the pose. Okay, second problem, and this is probably the most the problem people are being the most vocal about, is the tension in the wrist peg. Is very good, but when put up against this sword, it doesn't completely hold up. There's some interesting stuff going on here. So, first of all, it can hold the sword. You just have to be, again, intentional about the way you're positioning the wrist, because it will tend to drop it, especially under any kind of jostling. Why would they do that? Now, if we zoom in close to this wrist peg, this is different from a standard Figuarts style peg. Usually they will have some sort of ball at the end, which gives a little bit of extra tension to hold the hand on the wrist. Here, they've done something more similar to what Mafex does with wrists. And the first problem you run into because of that is the hands didn't fit the peg out of the box because they didn't include the hand trees that Mafex or like even Figma typically will include with figures that have hands with this design. So I had to heat the hands up to get them to fit on the peg at all. Second, it does mean that the tension holding the wrist is reduced. Now, I can think of a very good reason for that isn't just, oh, we wanted to use a different wrist than we would normally use for no reason, and oops, it didn't work. The reason that I think they did this is, again, the weight of this sword is a design challenge that they had to work around. And we've talked about in previous videos, I think in the Spider-Man comparison video, how delicate wrist pegs are, just as a consequence of being the smallest joints on figures. Joints are usually made with harder, more brittle plastic. Hard, brittle plus thin means more likely to break. And add part swapping on top of that, and you've got a recipe for something that could break a little bit too easily. Now, add even another constraint on top of that, which is you're going to be putting shear stress on that peg from the weight of this big sword. And if the wrist is not designed like this with a slip safety mechanism that allows the hand to fall off instead of snapping the peg, you're going to snap the peg. And so I think this design is intentional, and I think it's not intentionally bad. I think it's intentional that if the sword is not balanced in a way that reduces the shear stress on this peg, the hand should fall off, because the alternative is the peg breaks. And that is something that I have not seen anybody mention. And it's a big reason why I wanted to make this video. And you can say, okay, well, they just need to use a big, gigantic peg. Why'd they use such a tiny one? Well, look at the size of his arm. Like, there's not that much room there. It isn't exactly fun, but I think it's not without a purpose. I would like to see if they do come up with an alternative solution. But I do think this was on purpose, and I wouldn't be surprised if it continues. Now, what does it mean for this figure? Well, a lot of figures that are sword wielders, you put the sword in their hand and then you pose them. I think you've got to reverse the way that you're thinking about that here. Oh. Well, it happened. The pouch has come off. As I was saying, a lot of sword-wielding figures, you put the sword in their hand and then you pose them. I think you have to reverse that for this guy. And in fact, I think you maybe even want to put the hand on after posing the figure. Think of the hands as part of the sword. When he is using the sword, the hands go on the sword, the figure gets posed, and then the hands attach to the body. And I think that will help improve the experience of posing him with this gigantic sword. So we've got both hands on the sword. That means we need to bring the wrists close together. So to give him a good chance at balancing, you've got to give him a wide stance. And there you go. And if you don't like the way the shoulders look, again, use the articulated armor pieces to hide whatever it is. And there goes the wrist. Let's get him to pose swinging the sword out in front of him. We'll go over articulation in a lot of detail in a moment. But for now, let's just show you a taste of what these shoulders can do. When you know how to work them. Again, think of the sword, think of the hands as part of the sword. And I think you'll get a lot more enjoyment out of them. Give the cape a little scrunch. So you can see it takes a little effort, it takes some time, it takes some patience, and whether or not it's worth it to you, I guess, depends on you. But I am pretty impressed with the end result here. That is a hell of a sword swing pose. And there goes the sword. But, you know what? The hands are right where they need to be for me to just simply reattach it. Not a problem. Now, if I had to review this and move on, I can see how this would be frustrating. But if it was something I was willing to take my time with and savor, which is the whole point of this channel, I think there's a lot to be liked here still. Now for my last trick, I really just want to get him to balance. There we go. And while I was doing this pose, common issue has struck. This pouch that holds the crossbow popped off at the belt, or sheared off at the peg that's connected to the bandolier. And that's disappointing. I'll be honest, it's not the highest priority part for me. Not ideal, obviously. On the on the bright side, I don't have to worry about it falling off anymore. Now, that's maybe a little too optimistic for you, and I understand if it is. But that's not going to break my enjoyment of this figure. If his ankle joint gives out, that'll probably end it. And like I said, I can understand if you have a figure that is this price and it breaks. That's a very different story from a figure that's this price and has some design quirks. Or some complexity. Because I expect complexity for this price. I can work around complexity, but breakage, there's not much I can do about other than rely on the retailer or the distributor to have good customer service. I don't tell people to buy things on this channel. That's not what I'm here for. That yes, this figure has a lot of problems. Some of them I've encountered myself. Yeah, this is not really a figure I would recommend for everyone. I really don't think it's fair to label it as the worst figure, given that you can do this with it. This is what this figure is all about. Every design choice that they've made leads to this. Wielding that big sword, swinging it with all of the weight that it carries, and the figure almost helps you to achieve that effect. Finally, let's run through his articulation, and then we'll talk about other sword poses that you can try to pull off with this guy. And we'll go head to toe. We'll talk about the posability with and without certain parts. We'll talk about the cape, and I'm going to save the shoulders for last, because they're going to take some additional time, and I don't want to distract from the rest of it too much. So, starting at the top, the neck is connected into the torso with a ball joint, and then the head's on a barbell joint connected to the neck. And it poses really, really well, but it does run into this collar, which is not flexible. I think it would have been nice if it had a point of articulation or was a softer material or both, so that you could pose it without that concern, pose the head and the neck without that concern. But with the collar piece attached, let's go ahead and get the arms up in our standard articulation demo pose. Now, with the collar piece attached, he still looks up and down, no problem. Actually, he does. His ears run into those tips, so if you want him to look all the way up, yeah, you probably do want to remove this before doing that. Because, yeah, the ears will hit the tips of the collar. So, without the collar, though, he does look up that much, which is really about what you'd want, about 45 degrees. Down, buries the chin to his chest, again about 45. Looking down, let's see if the collar gets in the way for that. No problem with looking down while wearing the collar. Torso has at least 2, maybe 3 ball joints inside it. The bandolier can kind of ride over the sheath there when he's crunching forward. So all together with the neck looking down, plus the torso crunching. Torso crunch gives you maybe 30 degrees, plus the 45 from the neck. He can almost look straight down. And then going the other direction, again, watch out for the edge, watch out for those ears. You might be more careful with this if you still have your pouch attached on the back. Of course, I showed mine popped off earlier, which stinks, but it does mean that this is actually a little less scary to see how far back he can tilt. Really good range, about 45 degrees back, plus 45 at the neck. Gets him to look almost straight up, which is fantastic. Let's see. The hips are a little bit constrained due to the design of the armor. Kicking forward, he can get a little past 45 degrees, less than 90 though, maybe like 60 degrees. I wouldn't force it too much past that. Going backwards, hits the limit about there. The knee range is actually really good. About 135, which is fantastic for that amount of bulk in the armor. And the knee joint itself looks really good. When articulated, he's helped by the design of the armor being rather dark. These gaps don't stand out quite so much as they do on like bare skin, like at the elbow. That's a much more obvious cut than that one. But speaking of elbows, they're asymmetric, so we'll look at both of them, but about 135 on the right arm, maybe a little less. 90 plus 30, maybe 120 degrees. Left arm, yeah, that's more like 120. Point of articulation on this little armor piece, but doesn't really do anything. It's more just where it's attached. The ankles are really well designed, just not quite tight enough, but they go down like perfectly vertical. Toe joint even lets you move the joint downward a hint, just a smidge, and then going up. Ankles again, really good. And then toe joint goes up a great amount as well. Okay, about these wrists really quickly. They work fine. There's your up and down. It is impaired a little bit by that sculpt in that direction. Horizontal across the arm is a bit better thanks to the sculpt. The left hand doesn't have impairment from the wrist sculpt. Instead, it is impaired by the hand sculpt going up and down, but it still can get pretty good range in both those directions. And then side to side across the arm. Yeah, really good range on that, which you'd expect because there's really nothing in the way there. He can do a T-pose. Not 100% of the way, it's a little bit under a T. If you pull the shoulder out slightly, you can get it the rest of the way though. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. Alright, head tilting, you're not going to get any with the collar there, really. Just a little bit. But just to show you, I mean, without that collar piece, this head works, the head and neck joints work really well. So, kind of a shame that the collar is designed this way. Torso joints combined give you about 45 degrees of tilt, so that's pretty cool. These are two separate pieces of armor here. There's a floating piece in the middle piece is floating, and the bottom is fixed to something in there. But that's what allows him to kind of wobble around on that joint pretty well. And of course he can swivel there too, but you will probably pop that knife off more often than not. Each of these pouches on his belt is supposedly on a ball peg, but I don't like moving them around too much because of what happened on the back pouch. But they can kind of tilt and pivot around to work with the articulation of the rest of like the limbs and everything. They swivel. The butt flaps are not exactly a soft plastic, but they're softer, and so they can flex a little bit. It doesn't serve much purpose, really. Let's see. Kicking to the side, it's probably going to be different on each side due to the asymmetric belt. About there, it runs into his belt. About there. So, taken together, you can only get split apart about that much, which isn't incredible, but, you know, that's just kind of what you run into with this. I hope when they make Perfect Cell, who has a similar thigh armor type design. I hope they can come up with something here. Something that's stable, that allows him to kick to the side. I understand why it's limited this way, but again, it's always better. Like, he doesn't need to do 180-degree split, but 45 would be a worthy goal. I'm not sure if he could even, like, ride a horse. Yeah, he probably could ride a horse. We'll test that out in a little bit. Thigh swivel is a little bit limited. Again, it runs into Sculpt, but it does cruise past the butt plate armor, so you can get it pretty much to the point where he could sit cross-legged on the floor. So that's really good. No boot swivel, but that's okay because he has an ankle swivel and it works fine. And then your ankle pivot is actually, again, really, really good. Covered almost all the joints except the shoulders. Couple of notes. When I got mine, the upper neck joint was really tight and it needed oil, but now it moves very fluidly. The ankles, like I mentioned, are a little bit loose. They don't flop, but they don't support his weight as well as I would like. This leg, again, it doesn't flop, but it's a little bit light on the tension. I think it's a similar situation to what I ran into with the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, where, like, due to the materials or something, maybe for like armored, for characters with like a lot of texture, they like to use a harder plastic, it seems, to really capture that like sculpt detail. And sometimes it throws off the joint tolerances like this, is my guess. And then one weird thing, his right foot, where it's pegged into the ankle, hopefully you can see this, it sticks out a little further than his left foot, and it's maybe easiest if I show you like this. Not real sure what that's all about. Let's talk about his cape. I showed you the wires. It's got one around the perimeter and two down the middle. It's a cape that you kind of have to like crumple more than fold, if that makes sense. Again, it's almost like a thin denim. Very interesting material. It does pose all the way up. All the way straight back. How wide it gets if you fan it out all the way. Let's see, if you wanted it like flowing from one side to the other, it curls pretty well. Like that. Okay, let's talk about these shoulders. These are specialty shoulders if there ever were any. So I'm going to get the collar out of the way just so I can show you what's going on in here a little bit better. So, easy joints first. Bicep swivel is there. The shoulder pauldron is split into 3 layers, I guess 4 if you count this one connected more so on the torso. But you have this lower 3 plates on a ball joint connected up into the corner piece, which is on some kind of ball hinge on top of the shoulder. Here, let's go ahead and look at the third piece, which is this other plate that is on another ball joint into the corner. And then there's this long ball hinge. It's kind of like a normal ball hinge, but the peg for the ball going into the torso or into the shoulder socket piece is elongated to give you a little bit more posability. So those parts alone let you kind of get this rotator cuff action going. And that's really good. And I think that's what a lot of people are assuming is the extent of the shoulder articulation based on what I've seen. But there's actually quite a lot more. That is just scratching the surface. So let's talk about these innermost plates. They are connected on a ball joint to this inner shoulder piece just at the front, and so they can swivel and pivot on that joint as you move the shoulder. Now this is where the fun begins. My left shoulder was a bit stuck, and so I'll demo this on the right shoulder, but I got the left one working with a little silicone oil in some precise locations. The reason I knew it was supposed to be that way is the right one was working. Shoulder piece is actually on a hinge inside the torso that goes like this. So it actually will let you hinge that inner socket in and out like that. And so if you pull out, you can see how things kind of extend in and out there. So that's all the way in. That's all the way out. But wait, there's more. And the more is that the little shoulder socket piece isn't just like pegged straight into that inner hinge. It's actually on a barbell joint connected to that hinge. And so that allows it to not only hinge in and out, but to tilt all around on that ball. And so what that means is you can really extend the arm out of that socket. There you can see it's extended both at the hinge and on that barbell joint. See that? Very small, but right there. That is a barbell joint, and then the socket that it's plugged into in there is on a hinge, and the hinge goes like in and out. And so ultimately, all of that combined lets him do this. And this is what I'm talking about. I haven't seen anybody demonstrate this properly. Is what you need sword wielder arms to do. And that is really the point where I started to love this figure enough to make a video about it. As far as like range going in the opposite direction, it still also can achieve that, but that's more just thanks to like the extended pegs. Hands almost all the way together across the back. And then as far as going up, he gets phenomenal A pose, which again is what you want for a sword wielder, so that he can do over the head swings no problem. In fact, he gets almost X pose above the head. Really, really good. And again, this is with the collar removed. If I put the collar back on, I think the arms probably would have run out of room there. Nope, actually they're fine. Okay. So even with the collar on, he can get his arms up that much, which is fantastic. I'm just going to demonstrate that shoulder joint one more time. I'll explain what I had to oil on his left arm to make it work. The outer joints were fine. The problem I was having was the inner hinge wasn't moving, and the barbell joint wasn't moving. Once I applied oil to both of those, which I maybe went a little overboard with here, I try to wipe it off. So I took, I have a like syringe applicator for silicone oil. I took that and I put just the smallest amount you possibly can get. I put a drop, just a little into the hinge and a little into both ends of that barbell joint. And that is what unlocked the full shoulder range on this guy. And it has increased my enjoyment of this figure a lot. With the amount of armor that he's wearing, the chest armor makes it really hard because you can't hide a cut into the chest like you would for a normal butterfly joint. So he needs this like extending socket to get the arm past the chest. And the thinness of this under the shoulder sculpt at the top allows it to again press up into that armor so closely that he can bring his arm all the way across his body like that. That is what the designers had in mind. And so everybody's saying, oh, the shoulders are so ugly and they don't work. Well, if you get them to work as intended, you'll start to see the beauty of them, I think. That's the point of all the weirdness in the shoulders. It's to do that. Well, why didn't they just use the like piccolo style shoulder where it's just on a hinge piece that flies way out? Honestly, I couldn't tell you. I don't know if there's not room. Alright, let's talk about some sword wielding poses and we'll get out of here. He can hold it out in front straight up, but do keep in mind that that will put downward shear stress on the peg. It'll limit it because, and in this orientation, the center of gravity is straight over the hilt. And because of that, the vector is pushing straight down and not, when it's like this, you're also applying a torque because of the force of gravity at the center of mass. Okay, other orientations you might be interested in. Over the shoulder, or how about over his head? We talked about how well he can do an A pose. So this is exactly where that comes in handy. Let's go ahead and give him a shouting face for this one. Let's see if we can get him balanced like this. Patience and intention. That is the name of the game with this figure. Especially when you can pull off something like this. And I'm so close to balancing him without a stand. I would recommend if you display him, use a stand. I'm trying to not just see what he's capable of. But even without a steady, now we're getting somewhere. And if you play to the figure's strengths using the accessories, using the sword as an additional point of support instead of a burden, that's when he really starts to shine. I think this is what makes this figure rewarding, and if that is not enough to overcome the challenges to get here, then so be it. That is every collector's choice to make. And if I get too frustrated with the sword, I find it helps to shake things up and get creative with some of the other accessories. And I think these two make for quite a good duo. Shout out to the creative people at Weta and Toy Biz who cooked this up for Lord of the Rings. This is the Warg figure from way back in the day. One of the reasons I like Guts' design so much is it reminds me of like the Nazgul and the Mordor style armor. Speaking of the Mordor style armor, I thought these two might be a good match. For more of a regal look, this is the mount from the Mouth of Sauron figure. Another interesting association that I've heard is Dark Souls. I've heard Dark Souls is either inspired by or has some common DNA with Berserk. And to summarize this figure, that's not a bad metaphor, actually. I think describing him as like the Dark Souls of action figures is not a bad way to go. A bit difficult to handle, punishing if mishandled. It can be a very rewarding figure if you know what you're getting into and approach it with patience and precision. It will go a long way towards enjoying this figure.